Racist cop attacks black woman in court. Military police arrive without warning. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Alicia Monroe stood quietly near the defense table, hands relaxed at her sides, posture straight, eyes forward, as if the weight of the courtroom air had no effect on her at all. The county courtroom was older than most of the people inside it, with worn wooden benches, a faint smell of paper and polish, and fluorescent lights that hummed softly above. On a normal morning, it would have been just another routine session, another case passing through a system that prided itself on order. But nothing about this moment felt routine. Officer Daniel Crowley stood several feet away, uniform crisp, jaw tight, eyes fixed on Alicia with a confidence that came not from certainty, but from habit. He spoke loudly enough for the room to hear, his voice cutting through the low murmur of attorneys and spectators, accusing her of disrupting proceedings, of not knowing her place. The judge had not yet spoken. The bailiff hesitated, and in that hesitation, something fragile cracked. Alicia did not argue. She did not raise her voice or look to the audience for support. Instead, she breathed slowly, steady, and measured, the way someone does when they have been trained to remain calm under pressure. To those watching, she appeared like any other woman pulled unexpectedly into the center of attention. But there was a discipline in her stillness that went unnoticed by most. The courtroom reacted in pieces rather than as a whole. A man in the back shifted uncomfortably. A clerk glanced down at her desk. Someone coughed, too loudly, as if sound itself might interrupt what was happening. Officer Crowley stepped closer, crowding Alicia's space with an authority he believed the room would automatically endorse. His badge caught the light as he gestured, his words growing sharper, more insistent, while the judge tapped a pen against the bench. Instead of the gavel, Alicia's eyes flicked briefly toward the wall clock, not in panic, but in quiet calculation. She had been inside rooms like this before, rooms where power assumed it was unchallenged. The difference was that this time, the imbalance was being recorded, observed, and measured in ways no one present could yet see. Somewhere beyond the heavy courtroom doors, footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway, unnoticed beneath the rising tension. Officer Crowley mistook Alicia's silence for submission, mistook the judge's delay for approval, and mistook the stillness of the room for agreement. What he could not see was that Alicia Monroe was not waiting for permission to speak. She was waiting for something far more decisive. In a place built on procedure, she understood timing. And as the second hand of the clock slid forward, the atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the courtroom itself sensed that authority, once assumed, was about to be tested in a way none of them were prepared for. Alicia remained where she was as the murmur in the courtroom thickened, the sound carrying like static through the air. The judge finally shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, but still stopped short of taking control, as though he were weighing convenience against responsibility. Officer Crowley interpreted that pause as confirmation. He straightened his shoulders and addressed the room again, his voice firm and performative, reminding everyone that order had to be maintained, that compliance was expected, that authority did not need to explain itself. Alicia listened without reacting, her expression composed, her breathing steady, her gaze unfocused just enough to give nothing away. To the casual observer, she looked isolated, a single figure standing under the weight of institutional attention. What no one noticed was how deliberately she positioned herself. Feet evenly spaced, shoulders squared, stance balanced, not defensive, not submissive, but prepared. The bench behind her creaked as someone leaned forward, curiosity beginning to replace indifference. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating between recording procedure and documenting something that felt increasingly improper. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced briefly toward the gallery, perhaps searching for reassurance that silence would absolve him of action. Alicia's eyes moved once more, not toward the officer, but toward the small camera mounted high on the corner wall, its red indicator light barely visible. It was recording everything. Crowley took another step, lowering his voice as if proximity alone could establish dominance, reminding Alicia that this was a courtroom, that rules applied here, that she would do well to remember where she was. She met his gaze for the first time then, calm and unflinching, not with defiance, but with a level stare that unsettled him in ways he did not understand. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and quiet, long enough for the room to sense that something was off. The judge finally spoke, his tone cautious, instructing everyone to remain calm, yet still avoiding a direct order to stop. That hesitation hung heavier than any accusation. Alicia shifted her weight slightly, a minimal movement, but intentional, the kind made by someone accustomed to operating within strict parameters. In her mind, details aligned like markers on a timeline. The entry time, the escalation, the witnesses. She had not come here by accident, and she had not stayed silent out of fear. Outside the courtroom, beyond the thick wooden doors, footsteps moved closer, measured and purposeful, their sound softened by the carpeted hallway. Inside, Crowley continued, now speaking more to the room than to Alicia, framing his actions as procedure, as necessity, as something the system had always allowed. A few heads nodded reflexively. Others looked away. Alicia didn't either. She waited. The clock ticked past another minute. The air felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere in that space between authority assumed and authority proven, the balance began to shift. Alicia Monroe did not announce it. She did not need to. The system had been given enough time to reveal itself, and now, without a single raised voice or sudden movement, the next phase was already in motion. Alicia's silence began to change how the room perceived her, though no one could quite explain why. It was not dramatic, not confrontational, but steady enough to unsettle the assumptions everyone had walked in with. Officer Crowley paused mid-sentence, briefly thrown off by the fact that she had not reacted the way people usually did. There was no pleading, no visible fear, no attempt to win sympathy. Just composure. The judge shifted again, this time leaning forward slightly, his attention drawn not by noise, but by the tension that refused to dissipate. Alicia adjusted her jacket with a small, deliberate movement, revealing nothing new, yet somehow reinforcing the sense that she was exactly where she intended to be. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls had closed in by a few inches. Crowley cleared his throat and addressed the judge directly, framing the situation as a procedural concern, emphasizing his responsibility to maintain control. The words sounded practiced, familiar, like lines repeated many times before. Alicia listened, noting the rhythm of his speech, the reliance on authority rather than evidence. She had heard it all before, in different buildings, different cities, always with the same confidence that no one would interrupt. A woman in the gallery whispered something to the man beside her, then fell silent when the judge glanced their way. The clerk finally began typing, documenting what was happening in careful, neutral language. Alicia's presence had turned the room into a record. The judge asked a cautious question, one that avoided assigning blame, one that suggested delay rather than resolution. Crowley answered quickly, too quickly, eager to regain momentum. Alicia remained still, eyes forward, her calm now contrasting sharply with his urgency. For the first time, someone near the front row noticed the insignia on the inside of her jacket pocket, only partially visible, not enough to identify, but enough to spark curiosity. Another person noticed how she stood, balanced and controlled, as if trained to endure long moments without movement. These observations spread quietly, not as facts, but as impressions. Outside the courtroom, the hallway sounds grew clearer, footsteps stopping, then starting again, voices low and restrained. Inside, Crowley took a breath and stepped back half a pace, recalibrating, reminding himself that he was still in uniform, still protected by the structure around him. He gestured toward the bench, suggesting next steps, confident the judge would follow. The judge hesitated, his hand hovering near the gavel. Alicia's gaze shifted again, briefly meeting the judge's eyes, not challenging him, but acknowledging the choice in front of him. That moment lingered. It was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The system had reached a fork, and everyone could feel it. Alicia did not move to influence it. She had already done what she needed to do by standing exactly as she was. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking time with no regard for rank or reputation. In that quiet, the assumption that this was just another routine moment began to unravel. Whatever was about to happen next was no longer within Crowley's control, and not entirely within the judge's either. Alicia Monroe waited, not with anticipation, but with certainty, as the weight of the room shifted away from appearances and toward accountability. The tension in the courtroom no longer felt theoretical. It had weight now, pressing down on everyone seated inside, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Officer Crowley noticed it too, even if he refused to acknowledge the source. He straightened his uniform again, smoothing imaginary creases, reminding himself through posture that he belonged here. He spoke once more, louder than necessary, reinforcing procedure, citing rules, emphasizing how quickly situations could spiral if not controlled. His words were firm, but the confidence behind them had thinned. Alicia remained silent, her composure unchanged, yet something about her stillness now commanded attention rather than dismissal. The judge cleared his throat again, this time with uncertainty evident in the pause that followed. He glanced at the clerk, then at the bailiff, as if silently asking whether anyone else intended to intervene. No one did. The gallery had gone quiet, not out of obedience, but out of anticipation. People leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment had passed the point of routine. Alicia shifted her gaze toward the bench, acknowledging the judge's presence without appealing to it. She did not need him to rescue her. That realization unsettled him more than any raised voice would have. Crowley interpreted the judge's hesitation as an opportunity to press harder, reframing the situation as a matter of compliance, insisting that failure to act decisively would undermine authority. He spoke of standards, of precedent, of the importance of maintaining order in public institutions. Alicia listened, noting the absence of facts, the reliance on assumption. Her breathing remained even, controlled, the kind learned through repetition and accountability. A faint sound echoed from the hallway outside, a door opening, then closing, followed by footsteps that stopped just beyond the courtroom entrance. No one turned yet, but the sound registered. Crowley continued, now pacing slightly, his words accelerating, as if speed could replace substance. The judge finally raised a hand, signaling for calm, but again stopped short of issuing a firm directive. The silence that followed was charged, uncomfortable, and revealing. Alicia stood unmoving at the center of it, a quiet constant while authority circled itself. Someone in the gallery whispered a question that went unanswered. The clerk paused her typing, fingers hovering, uncertain how to label what was unfolding. Crowley glanced briefly toward the doors, then back to Alicia, irritation flashing across his face as he realized the room was no longer fully with him. The balance had shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. Alicia's eyes returned to the clock, marking another passing minute. Time was no longer neutral. Outside, the hallway grew still, as if those waiting understood the importance of timing as well. Inside, the judge finally reached for the gavel, lifting it an inch above the bench, then hesitated again. That hesitation spoke louder than any ruling. Alicia did not react. She had given the system every opportunity to correct itself. The fact that it had not was now part of the record. Crowley took a breath, preparing to speak again, unaware that the moment for words was slipping away. The courtroom stood suspended between what had always been allowed and what could no longer be ignored, and Alicia Monroe remained exactly where she was meant to be as the next presence prepared to make itself known. The room settled into an uneasy stillness that felt deliberate, as if every sound now had consequences. Officer Crowley stopped speaking, not because he had finished, but because the room no longer responded the way it had moments before. His authority, once assumed, now required acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement was no longer automatic. The judge's hand rested on the gavel, fingers tense, eyes fixed on a point just beyond Alicia, as though he were sensing something approaching rather than seeing it. Alicia stood calmly, her presence anchoring the space, her silence now unmistakably intentional. She was no longer simply enduring the moment. She was documenting it with her composure. The clerk resumed typing, slower now, careful with every word, aware that what she recorded might be reviewed far beyond this room. A low murmur rippled briefly through the gallery before dissolving again, replaced by a quiet attention that bordered on reverence. Outside the courtroom doors, movement resumed, controlled and precise, the kind that did not rush yet never hesitated. The sound carried just enough to be noticed, shoes striking the floor in even intervals, stopping, then continuing, as if timed to something unseen. Crowley glanced again toward the doors, irritation mixing with uncertainty. He reminded himself that nothing had officially changed, that no order had been given, that he was still within his role. Yet the confidence that once fueled his voice had thinned into defensiveness. He adjusted his stance, attempting to reclaim the center of the room, but the space resisted him. Alicia's eyes lifted slightly, not toward him, but toward the judge, acknowledging the responsibility resting on that bench. It was not a challenge, but it was not permission either. The judge swallowed, his hesitation now clearly visible. He had waited too long, and he knew it. The silence stretched again, thick and revealing. Then, from the hallway, came the unmistakable sound of a door opening fully, not abruptly, but with purpose. Several heads turned instinctively. The bailiff straightened, alert without knowing why. Crowley stiffened, his jaw tightening as his focus shifted from Alicia to the entrance. Alicia did not move. She had already accounted for this moment. Her breathing remained even, her posture unchanged, as if the external shift merely confirmed what she had known all along. The judge lowered his hand from the gavel, his eyes now fixed on the doorway, uncertainty giving way to concern. The gallery leaned forward as one, no longer passive observers, but witnesses anticipating a conclusion that would not be shaped by routine. The atmosphere transformed, not with noise or spectacle, but with recognition. Whatever was stepping closer was not here to argue. It was here to assert. Crowley sensed it, even if he did not yet understand it. And for the first time, he said nothing. Alicia Monroe remained at the center of the courtroom, calm and unwavering, as the weight of accountability pressed inward from all sides. The system had been given time, patience, and opportunity. Now, without her saying a word, it prepared to face something it could not dismiss, delay, or control. The door at the back of the courtroom opened fully now, not with drama, but with certainty, and the change it brought was immediate. The air shifted as several uniformed figures stepped into view, their movements coordinated, restrained, and unmistakably official. They did not rush, did not raise their voices, and did not scan the room in confusion. They entered as if they already understood exactly what they were walking into. The bailiff straightened instinctively, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. The judge rose slightly from his chair before catching himself, settling back down with a visible swallow. Officer Crowley froze where he stood, his posture rigid, his attention pulled away from Alicia despite his effort to remain composed. Alicia did not turn at first. She did not need to. The sound of measured footsteps told her everything. She had counted the seconds, anticipated the timing, trusted the process she had set in motion long before she ever stepped into this building. The lead officer stopped just inside the doorway, his presence commanding without aggression, his gaze sweeping the room once before settling on the bench. He spoke calmly, identifying himself and the authority under which he was present, his tone factual, not confrontational. The room listened in silence. The judge nodded stiffly, acknowledging the statement, suddenly aware that his earlier hesitation had consequences. The clerk's fingers moved quickly now, recording names, titles, timestamps, details that would not be erased. Crowley attempted to speak, clearing his throat as if to reclaim the narrative, but the words caught. For the first time, his badge did not feel like a shield. It felt like a question. The lead officer turned slightly, acknowledging Crowley without engaging him, then directed his attention back to the judge, explaining that the proceedings were subject to immediate review due to jurisdictional authority. There was no accusation in the statement, only a declaration of process. Alicia finally turned her head, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. The presence behind her was not a rescue. It was confirmation. The gallery sat motionless, witnessing a rare moment when the usual hierarchy paused and reconfigured itself in real time. The judge placed both hands on the bench, nodding again, his voice measured as he responded, aware that every word now mattered more than it ever had before. Crowley stepped back half a pace, not ordered to do so, but compelled by the shift he could no longer deny. Alicia remained centered, neither advancing nor retreating, her role unchanged. She had not asked for this intervention. She had earned it through patience and precision. The lead officer glanced at her briefly, a look of recognition rather than surprise, then returned to the matter at hand. The courtroom no longer felt like a stage for performance. It felt like a record being set straight. The clock continued to tick, but time itself seemed less forgiving now, less willing to accommodate assumption. Alicia Monroe stood quietly as authority recalibrated around her, not because she needed to be seen, but because the truth no longer required her to speak. The presence in the room settled into a new order, one defined not by volume or intimidation, but by clarity. The lead officer stepped forward just enough to be heard without commanding attention through force, his voice even, deliberate, and precise as he addressed the judge again. He referenced jurisdiction, oversight, and review, each word carrying weight because it was chosen carefully. The judge listened closely now, nodding with a seriousness that had been absent earlier, fully aware that the moment for passive neutrality had passed. Officer Crowley stood slightly apart, no longer at the center of the space he had claimed minutes earlier. His posture remained upright, but the certainty behind it had drained away, replaced by a guarded stillness. Alicia remained where she was, her calm unchanged, her role in the unfolding moment still unspoken but unmistakable. The gallery watched in silence, absorbing the shift as something rare and instructive rather than dramatic. The clerk continued to document, her typing steady, capturing not emotion, but fact. The lead officer acknowledged Alicia for the first time by name, his tone respectful and formal, as if confirming what the process had already determined. There was no explanation offered to the room, no announcement of status or rank. None was needed. The way the officer addressed her said enough. Alicia inclined her head slightly in response, not as submission, but as acknowledgement of protocol. The judge followed the exchange with careful eyes, recognition dawning as he connected details he had previously ignored. His earlier hesitation replayed in his expression, now tinged with concern. Crowley shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the judge, then at Alicia, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The assumptions he had relied on no longer held. The lead officer continued, outlining next steps with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to accountability, explaining that the proceedings would pause pending review. The words were procedural, but their impact was profound. The room accepted them without protest. Alicia remained silent, her restraint reinforcing the legitimacy of what was happening. She did not correct anyone. She did not clarify. The process spoke for her. The judge formally acknowledged the directive, his voice controlled, his demeanor respectful, aware that this record would extend beyond his courtroom. Crowley opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, recognizing that the moment for justification had passed. The gallery remained still, not out of fear, but out of understanding that they were witnessing something uncommon, recalibration rather than a confrontation. Alicia's presence anchored the room through it all, a reminder that authority did not always arrive with warning or spectacle. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried by patience, preparation, and timing. As the lead officer concluded his statement and stepped back into position, the courtroom felt steadier, not because tension had vanished, but because it had been addressed. Alicia Monroe stood at the center of that clarity, unchanged by the attention, her silence now fully understood not as vulnerability, but as control. The courtroom did not erupt into noise or confusion after the directive was acknowledged. Instead, it settled into a disciplined quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. The lead officer remained near the doorway, presence steady, while the others positioned themselves without blocking sight lines or restricting movement. It was not a show of force, but of structure. The judge formally announced a recess, his voice controlled, careful to follow protocol to the letter now that every detail mattered. The clerk read back the time and noted the pause, her tone precise, her hands no longer hesitant. Officer Crowley stood still, his eyes forward, absorbing the shift that had placed him outside the center he once occupied. No one addressed him directly, and that omission carried its own weight. Alicia remained composed as the judge acknowledged her standing and confirmed that she was free to step away from the defense table. She did so without hurry, taking measured steps that reflected relief only in the absence of restraint, not in celebration. The gallery watched her move with a new awareness, seeing not a spectacle, but a correction. The lead officer quietly confirmed names and details with the clerk, ensuring the record was complete, while another officer requested the relevant recordings be preserved. These were routine actions, yet in this context they felt decisive. Crowley shifted slightly, then stopped himself, recognizing that any movement now would be interpreted, not ignored. He listened as the judge addressed the room again, emphasizing respect for process and reminding everyone present of the standards expected within the court. The words sounded different now, heavier, more accountable. Alicia paused near the aisle, not leaving immediately, her attention still anchored to the space she had entered with purpose. The lead officer approached her at a respectful distance, speaking quietly, confirming next steps, and acknowledging her cooperation. She responded with a brief nod, her voice calm when she answered, measured and clear, offering only what was required. No explanations followed. None were necessary. The gallery remained silent as Alicia turned toward the exit, her departure unmarked by applause or commentary, yet followed by every eye. The judge remained seated, shoulders squared, as if grounding himself in the responsibility he could no longer defer. Crowley watched Alicia pass, recognition finally replacing assumption, the realization that authority was not always visible until it chose to be. The officers began to coordinate the transition with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the pause in proceedings was orderly and documented. The clock continued its steady movement, but the room no longer felt suspended. It felt resolved, at least in part. Alicia reached the doorway and paused for a brief moment, not to look back, but to acknowledge the lead officer with another small nod, a mutual recognition of duty fulfilled. She exited without fanfare, leaving behind a courtroom that had been recalibrated by patience rather than confrontation. Inside, the judge sat in the quiet that followed, aware that the record would speak louder than any explanation he could offer. Officer Crowley remained where he was, no longer the author of the moment, but a subject within it. The system, having been given time and clarity, had adjusted itself, and the absence of spectacle made the outcome unmistakably real. The courtroom remained quiet long after Alicia Monroe had exited, a silence that lingered not from shock, but from reflection. The judge sat still behind the bench, reviewing the notes before him with a seriousness that had replaced his earlier hesitation. Every decision he had delayed now carried weight, not only within those walls, but beyond them. The clerk finalized the record, careful and precise, understanding that this documentation would speak long after memory softened the details. Officer Crowley stood where he had been left, no longer addressed, no longer directing the room, forced to confront the absence of the authority he once relied on without question. He did not argue. There was nothing left to say. The lead officer remained near the entrance, observing quietly as the process concluded, ensuring that the transition occurred with the same restraint that had defined his arrival. The gallery began to shift slowly, people rising from their seats, exchanging subdued glances rather than whispered commentary. What they had witnessed did not invite gossip. It invited thought. Outside the courtroom, Alicia moved down the hallway at an unhurried pace, her footsteps measured, her posture unchanged. There was no visible relief, no sign of triumph, only the calm that came from knowing the system had been allowed to reveal itself fully. She had not raised her voice, demanded attention, or asserted identity. She had simply stood still long enough for truth to surface on its own. Behind her, the courthouse resumed its routine rhythm, yet something fundamental had shifted. The judge eventually stood, adjusting his robe, aware that neutrality without action was no longer defensible. Crowley finally turned away from the bench, understanding that the badge he wore did not exempt him from scrutiny, only from accountability he had assumed would never arrive. The officers coordinated their departure quietly, leaving the room exactly as they had found it, altered not by force, but by clarity. Outside, daylight filtered through the tall windows, unchanged and indifferent, reminding everyone that justice did not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it arrived through patience, timing, and a refusal to surrender dignity. Alicia stepped outside into the open air, pausing briefly as she adjusted her jacket, her face composed, her focus already forward. What happened inside the courtroom was not an ending. It was a correction. The system had been tested not by aggression, but by restraint, and it had responded when it could no longer hide behind assumption. Those who remained inside would carry the record with them, each decision now framed by what they had witnessed. Alicia Monroe walked away without looking back, knowing that the most powerful moments rarely belonged to those who spoke the loudest, but to those who understood when silence was enough. The courtroom doors closed behind her, not sealing the truth inside, but releasing it into a system forced, at last, to listen.